I'm Scott L. Miller. It's the 2nd of August, 2022, and welcome to my vlog of daily life in Leon, Nicaragua. Welcome to Tuesday here in the city, and it is a really busy day for all of us. We have a bunch of stuff going on at our hospitality properties that is making today kind of crazy. Not really things I can talk about. I mean, one's pretty simple. We just had something stolen from a parking lot and lots of having to deal with police and stuff, and it just keeps people tied up, and we're implementing new computer systems and stuff at all the places, so we're running around implementing new computers and hooking up equipment and stuff, and it's just really, really busy. And so because Paul and Dominica are running around doing that stuff, Dominica's in Las Piñas and Paul is in El Viejo, and everyone's in a different place. I am here with the kids and the dogs and really busy with stuff in the office. I'm supposed to be going to tour a place in Chinandega tomorrow. Fingers crossed that I'll be able to make it to see that. Just really, really busy with work stuff. So I'm here all day, but I did manage to do some video stuff. So that's been good. And obviously just working in the office, very, very busy. So not very much to report as far as news today. It was a pretty mundane day throughout, but I did go grocery shopping this afternoon. I managed to go a little bit early, so I was able to get through when the lines weren't too bad, but boy, did I pick the right time, because I did a bit of shopping. When I went to check out, I was like the third person in line, and by the time I made it to the register, the line was like halfway back through the store, and they were opening more registers, and it was like a mob scene. So that worked out really well. It was not a long shopping trip at all. Came home, and by that point, it's about 5 o'clock, 5:30. The kids were kind of hungry because we had done a light lunch. So I cooked dinner, just did egg and cheese sandwiches, which I did on the video the other day so you can see what they look like. And then they were really interested in spending the evening doing some video gaming. So once we had had dinner, and I had done a few wrap-up things in the office, we actually started video gaming together pretty early. We played a little bit, just the first chapter of Bendy and the Ink Machine, which is totally not my style game, not my thing, but the girls really wanted me to play it. So I am doing that playthrough with them just giving commentary on Loaf Gaming. So we recorded that first episode. I'm not sure when that'll be up, a few weeks probably, because we do have quite a few that I'm working on currently. And then we also then played Uninvited, which was pretty long. It's probably 2 gaming sessions, I think, that we'll get out of that. And that is, we talked about before, the 1986 game that I played somewhere around 1988. So exactly at the ages they are, about 12 years old, because Luciana is 11 and Liesl is 13. And I really liked it back then, and so playing it together with them at the same ages and making it a family thing, it's really special for me and a lot of fun. And at first, if you watch the videos we did, they weren't too into it in the first several videos, and that was 2 gaming nights, so it took us a total of 3 nights to get through it. But this, when we played the last portion, for whatever reason, they got really into the game, were really enjoying it, and by the end, we're having a lot of fun, and we talked about some gaming history at the end, and then they were both like, well, I want to play more like this. They want to play Deja Vu, they want to play Shadowgate, the Mac Ventures series, all from 1986, so we'll be doing some of those in the future. That made me think about talking on this channel about video games and kids, because a lot of you know we homeschool, and I spend a lot of time with my kids, and video games are a big part of our lives and always have been, and it's something that in real life I've talked about pretty extensively, but I've never really talked about on the vlog. And that is why I think that video games are so important for kids. So in normal conversations, in growing up, right, we always talked about books are so good. We want our kids to read books. We got read. We never ask why, right? Because reading is actually a weird thing. So as a thing that we promote, it's very passive, right? You pick up a book, someone else put in the effort to write it. Now, if you're talking about a book that has loads of great information in it, of course, it's great to read. It's important to know how to read, because it's a wonderful way to acquire information, and writing is a great way to collect that information, right? So reading's important. I don't want to downplay the importance of reading. But at some point historically, that became translated into a couple really unhealthy things. One is that just making any fiction and putting it on paper magically gave it a quality where people would say, oh, you were doing something wasted with your life, but now that you're reading some garbage that's been written on paper, that makes it an important activity. That's total BS. We also got the problem, and this was taught very heavily in the 1970s and 80s when I was a kid, anything that passed a publisher's muster, anything that a publisher was willing to put on paper was considered perfectly good reference material. By the time we got to the internet era, we have things like Wikipedia, which are heavily peer-reviewed and constantly checked over and monitored, and people question, oh, you can't trust that. all the time. And for good reason. You can't. You got to be careful what you're reading. But Wikipedia is one of the most peer-reviewed things in the history of literature of any sort, anywhere, ever. And yet, when we were kids, anybody with enough money to get a printing press together or to hire someone to print something, if they did that, they were considered above reproach. There was no way you could question it. Anytime you wrote a paper, did any research, all you had to do was reference a publisher's ID number, and it was considered golden. You never had to be critical of it. You never had to think about it. You never had to notice if it was true. You never had to verify it at all. The nature of publishing, the nature of it being a book, gave it a free pass on everything, which completely taught the lack of need for critical thinking. It's horrible the way that we've treated reading, especially as it's just a passive thing. As someone who has written a ton over their lifetimes, I know how easy it is to write and publish. Sure, you can do great things, and there's wonderful books out there, including fiction and literature, or just technical things or business things or non, histories, whatever. But there's so much garbage, and it is so easy to turn out garbage, and people turn out whatever people will buy, not whatever's true or valuable. So that there's tons of really awful fiction out there, and not that there shouldn't be. People need entertainment, but we have to look at it for what it is. Worthless. One of the worst things you could possibly do because it's completely passive. Now, we gave all this flack to things like television and movies for a long time because they were the new technology. Right? But in reality, they're just like books, right? They are passive. We say, but books make you use your imagination. Television and movies make you use your imagination too. They also fill you in on more things and make it easier to share the experience with others. They actually have some pretty big advantages over books, but all of them are passive forms of entertainment. And this goes for theater as well. Theater at least has the advantage of it being a live performance, and there's this opportunity for an expression and connection with the artist, but essentially, it's the same thing. It's just, if you put a television camera in front of it, now it's both television and a live performance. Does the fact that it's being recorded change it? No, all of these things are passive literature. There's nothing wrong with passive literature. It's an important part of the human experience. But you have to look at it for what it is. It is a form of art. It is a form of expression. And it is passive for the reader. Its value should be at the lowest tier. It is below actual human interaction. It is below learning. It is below writing. It is below performance. It is the relaxing activity, the one that you can fall asleep during, and it's not a problem. So why do I like video games, and why am I mentioning this? Video games represent a form of literature the same as all of those. What is different is that video games, in order to be a video game, the thing that makes it a video game is that it is an interactive experience rather than a passive one. Now, of course, early video games, and this is where they get a bad rap, were garbage. If you look at Pac-Man, for example, there is no story, there's no literature, there's nothing to be learned from it. It is purely, and it's barely even a game. It is basically that you are talking about just some pixels on a screen and seeing how fast you can move a stick. Technically a game, but barely. If we look at the very first books, which of course we can't, they had to be absolute garbage as well. Just a few words written down as people experimented with how do I write words on paper. Once they figured out how to do it, then books started getting more interesting pretty quickly. But before that, we had oral traditions that were able to tell deep and rich stories that we weren't able to put on paper for the first while. So the same conversation would have happened with books when they first came out. Oh, books are worthless. They can only hold 15 words, and those words have to be really short. It's just stupid, but I can stand up and talk to you for an hour and tell you all these things. That's so much better. But over time, books took on a whole new meaning as they figured out how to bind them and make them easy to read and quality fonts and all those kinds of things. We created this entire ecosystem around publishing that made books so much better over time. And now we recognize how important they are. They're able to take those oral traditions and maintain them in ways that the oral tradition could not. And so we fell in love with books, and all this money went into it. And there was an era where published books were incredibly expensive. And so they took on sort of a mythos because only the rich and the educated could ever have a book. So the things that went into books typically were really important. Someone had to really be confident that people would buy it, or be really assured of the value that they were providing, that they were willing to invest in making the book in the first place. That is gone. Now making a book takes nothing. Anybody, any kid can go out, write a few things, go on tools online, publish a book, have it on Amazon, and have it shipped to somebody. It may not look as nice as one coming from a professional publisher, but it sure can come close pretty easily. So the whole concept of these barriers to entry are gone. Video games went through that same thing. The early video games were complete garbage because they were just figuring out how to make games, how to package games, how to publish games, how to get them into the hands of the players, and teaching people how to play games, because at first, we didn't even know, just like the first books, no one knew how to read. We had to teach people how to read in order for books to be useful. We had to teach people how to be literate in video games in order for them to be useful. But we crossed that barrier during the 1980s. So in the early 1980s, we had purely just the figuring out the mechanisms of gaming. By the late 1980s, we were starting to evolve into mature games. By the 90s, we were turning out games that could really tell a story. Now, today, we are well into the mature video game era. It is like with published books and movies and television, all those things went through it's just entertaining because it's a novelty that we can do it. Now they're all forms of art that take tons of research and work, and you don't typically do it casually. The things that people actually watch are often well invested in. Video games are now at this point, and this makes them important because take all the things that you like about books, take all the things you like about television and movies, take all of them and elevate them to a higher level of art. Video games take all of those things and make them interactive. They make you a part of the story. So for this reason, I find that this is vastly more important, orders of magnitude better than any passive literary experience. I don't want to completely eliminate passive literary experience. That is important ways of disseminating known stories to the world. Tom Sawyer is still a great book, regardless of the fact that video games are a superior form of disseminating the experience. But not every story can be told actively, but the best ones probably can. When we start looking at video games today, the depth of story that we have can be intense. Instead of a movie that takes 2 hours to watch, we can make a game that takes 300 hours to play. Instead of something you can fall asleep during and have it finish without you actually paying any attention, you have to actively be involved potentially. You have to do things. You have to make the story happen. You have to make decisions. You are part of the story. The experience is something you're actually experiencing, not just something you're witnessing. It is a completely different level of interaction, and it changes the way that our brain works with things. Stories that we have helped tell, that we've helped form, are much more built into us. They're much more remembered. They're much more a part of our experience than something we've watched. When I watch a movie, I don't think, man, I lived through that experience. But when I play a really good video game, I take away a bit of, I was there. Right? If I'm playing a video game where I have to save a town from an explosion, from a volcano, right? And I'm running around telling people to get out. I'm feeling the panic. I'm making decisions. I'm deciding which house to go into and try to save them, which house not to. Those decisions, they become part of us. They help us expose how we think about things, and they help us develop our thought processes. Passive learning doesn't do that. If anything, it teaches us to sit back and let others do our entertaining, others tell the story. Sometimes we need that, but it is certainly not what we want most of the time. Not what we would want for our kids. We want our kids doing things that are going to develop their minds, help them think about how they think, help them solve puzzles. All those kinds of things. There's so much more potential thought. Now, of course, if we're only looking at antique style video games, things like Pac-Man, of course they still exist. They technically are still video games. Yeah, they're garbage. You can make garbage video games, just like you can make garbage books and garbage television and garbage movies. You can make them. Every format can have garbage, right? And every format starts as garbage. But what matters is what can it get to. And great movies are fantastic. And great books are fantastic. And great television shows are fantastic. But great video games are not just fantastic. They're fantastic to a level none of those other media can compete with because they are passive. So video games are really important. And there's something that not just I love because it's something I get to do with my children, and it's a bonding experience, and it's something that we care about, and Liesl wants to go into video games as a career. All of those things are important for other reasons. But from a purely how I want my children to spend their time, there are very few activities that I find as valuable as playing video games, because it is the most engaging, the most intense storytelling and story living experience that we have. It is a whole new level of literature, and I really recommend, if I know a lot of people grew up with this pressure from our parents that books were good. Why did the parents think that books were good? Because schools were built around them, so always promoted them, and publishers made big money by pushing them. So publishers and schools had a huge incentive to convince us as a society that we should be spending money on books. And they convinced the government that the government should step in and buy books and provide them to the community, right? They did so much to promote books, and it was just because it was big business. But it made the generation before us really, really push books in an inappropriate way. They were just giving in to big business and promoting the interests of large companies, not the interest of the learner, not the interest of those getting the experience. So we grew up with that, and it's very, very hard to take that pressure, which went on for so long, it was so intense and so ingrained in the social consciousness, and combine it with, we grew up, if you're anywhere near my age, with the garbage of the very first video games as they figured out the mechanisms of video games. So of course video games of that era were garbage. Spending time playing Pac-Man and Spy Hunter and Space Invaders, that was basically wasted time. Yes, we could figure out how controls worked, and there's the novelty, and it was fun, kinda, but it was garbage time. We got no literary experience from it. Those things that we think are important to the human experience was basically missing. You were not engaged emotionally beyond getting a high score. Because that happened, combined with that social pressure of buying books, really makes it hard for my generation to see past that and realize, wow, video games are honestly one of the best human activities. Of course, interacting with real humans can be better. Of course, writing a book or making a game or coming up with a skill, becoming a photographer, any number of things you do can be better. But when it comes to the literary experience, of any optional literary experience that you can have, video games are the one that you want to have most. When given the choice, you should always be opting for video games for your children. Nothing is better for them, right? Now, of course, when I'm really tired, sometimes I just want to watch some TV and I just don't have the energy for a video game. If anything, that shows how important they are. My brain is burned out. I can't do this really great activity for it. I need to bring it to something simpler. Something like reading or television or movies. All of them are just escapes. Just turn off my brain as much as possible, relax. Whereas video games, turn on my brain, become engaged, work it harder, develop those pathways, improve my decision making, speed up my decision making, fight off Alzheimer's. So for all those reasons, video games are something I'm very passionate about. Even though I don't get very much time to play, I want my kids to be able to play. I want my kids to appreciate how wonderful games can be. And some of the games we're playing, we're now at a point where we're able to go back to 1986 and look at historic games. These are the very first games learning to tell stories, the very first ones coming up with intricate puzzles. My kids are even talking about, wow, it's amazing how the dialogue they put into this early game and some of the sound effects they had. Like, how did they do this on an 800K floppy in black and white all those years ago? That's some amazing stuff. Of course, today they could do it, but back then, right, they're starting to appreciate that this was the story they were able to tell given the technology of the time. So having a historical context is something they're building out of video games. It's really a wonderful thing. So as a literary experience, if you've never looked at video games this way for yourself or for the children in your life, I want you to think about it. How could you possibly have a better literary experience? If you're okay with your kids reading books, if you're okay with them watching TV, if you're okay with them watching movies, you should logically say, wow, if we took whatever this was passively and turned it into a video game, that would be so much better for my children, so much more educational, so much more engaging, so much better for their brains, so much better for their just life experience. That's how we would want it to be. And there are amazing games out there. The biggest problem is when we look at games, everyone wants to point out the garbage games to distract from how good they can be. But if we did the same with books, there's an endless supply. Go to your local bookstore and wander around. They're not all Harry Potter or a David McCullough history, right? Most of them are just awful. And if we pointed to those, of course, we'd be like, wow, reading is just a worthless activity. These books are terrible. So we have to stop cherry picking the bad in one case and the good in the other to compare. We need to cherry pick the good in both cases. And when we say, oh, I'd like my kids to play video games, yeah, I want them to play good ones, right? And that sometimes means taking some time to learn. If I was going to tell them to read a good book, I know some already, right? Tom Sawyer, Swan's Way, whatever, right? It's Shakespeare, right? I can tell you good ones to go read. Video games, we need to have that same kind of library built up in our minds, our same access to games ready. Go play Fable, go play Dragon Age, go play Mass Effect, go play something online. Now, games also have a social aspect that doesn't exist in reading, and it barely in any way exists in movies. Sure, I can watch this movie, you can watch it at the same time, we can talk about it, we can read it, it's different, right? At least with movies and TV, in theory, we can sit in the same room and like discuss it as it happens. It's a little bit social, but video games you can actually participate in together in some cases. And that's a whole world of socialization inside of a literary experience that completely doesn't exist in other formats. And it's another level in itself beyond that. And even before there were graphics, back in the 70s and 80s, we still had MUDs and were able to play games that were incredibly deep and rich in their storytelling and socially interactive, allowed you to make friends with real people, struggle to figure out who's real and who's computerized, get to know people, know characters, tell a story as well as be told a story. Thanks for joining me. I want to have some discussion about video games down there. And if you haven't checked out our channel where we play video games, it's Loaf Gaming. If you go to my page on YouTube, just scroll down a little bit, and I've got my other channels in there, and you can see the Bread Loaf Gaming. Like and subscribe, share on social media, and I will see all of you tomorrow.